So over the past 2 decades, we've seen the internet grow up, and as a side effect, personal information was spread around the world. So everybody has data on the internet now, and we're starting to see some of the consequences of that. So we'll start with data breaches. Last fall, we saw 3 of the worst data breaches in history. Equifax started with 143 million social security numbers leaked and credit information. Yahoo, it turned out, lost all 3 billion account details. Uber had 57 million breached, and they were even caught trying to pay ransom to the hackers to keep it quiet. And basically, the consumers have been left completely dumbfounded, feeling like it's completely out of their control.
Yeah, and so you'd imagine that some pretty intense hacking would have been going on to cause all these breaches, like breaking past firewalls, cracking encryption, stealing passwords, dropping phishing emails. But in reality, all it really takes to hack a $15 billion multinational corporation with personal data of 800 million people are these 2 words, admin and admin. The lack of concern for privacy continued well past the initial breach. As a coping mechanism, Equifax put up a portal for their consumers to come check if their information had been breached. A portal that was littered with marketing opportunities. They were using it as an opportunity to sell yet another product. But it turned out that the initial use of the portal didn't even work for intended purposes. In fact, the portal was returning random results. There were people that were filling out completely arbitrary information, and it was indicating that that person had been hacked. Not only that, but it also provided another opportunity for phishing attacks. Hackers were putting up mock Equifax websites and hoping that ignorant people would come, put their personal information into the website to check if they were hacked. So to give some benefit of the doubt to Equifax, you would think, hey, it's really not the easiest thing in the world to protect against a phishing attack. Did they really do anything wrong? But wait, the company's verified Twitter profile was tweeting the wrong links. Instead of linking people to EquifaxSecurity2017.com, they were sending them to SecurityEquifax2017.com. Like, first of all, isn't SecurityEquifax2017.com like already fishy enough? And second of all, like, how did they send the wrong link? These tweets were up for over a day. All in all, it really showed how little the company cared about privacy, especially for respecting an individual's privacy.
So who is Equifax, and why do they have all of our data? So Equifax began in a Tennessee grocery store over a century ago in 1898. The brothers who owned the store compiled a list of customers they considered to be creditworthy, and they would share that with other business owners in the town for a small fee. The demand was huge, so the brothers moved to Atlanta and began buying up similar lists, compiling them into a book, and selling them to other businesses. And this is why they're called consumer credit reporting agencies. So then, around 1970, the U.S. government, in response to consumer demand for more transparent and fair credit reporting, created the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And this was largely because they started computerizing and digitizing their records, and the result of it was a lot more people started getting denied loans, denied insurance, because there was a lot more information available, and there was more reasons to decline people. So after being fined a lot throughout the 70s, they changed their name to Equifax to shed their old reputation. And Equifax and other credit reporting agencies fall under a larger umbrella category of companies called data brokers.
Yeah, and so what is a data broker? A data broker, or an information broker, is a class of non-consumer facing companies that collect massive amounts of personal information and they sell it on the market. So in a previous project we were working on, we were actually helping people opt out of data brokers, and here's a little video that we had built just to describe the process.
Is privacy dead? Well, we all know our personal information is for sale, right? Your browsing history, your home address, the things you're interested in, where you work, how much you make, and your entire financial history. How is that even possible? Data brokers, often described as the biggest companies you've never heard of, buy information about you from the apps you use and sites you visit. They dig through public records, customer databases, and social media websites. Then they compile all this information into a dossier about you and sell it to any business or agency that's interested. To be clear, this is all perfectly legal in America. In fact, the law is shifting in favor of more data trading and less privacy for individuals. So, how can you protect your privacy in an unregulated market? Transcend is a new company that will help you gain control of your data.
Yeah.
And then we pivoted.
Yeah. And so, Equifax is really only the start of this entire industry. It's a pretty interesting industry, and it's really not filled with a lot of brand name companies because it's not because it's an unprofitable industry. It's because these people are selling your data without your consent, and so they kind of want to stay out of the limelight. There are approximately 4,000 companies in the U.S. that can be labeled as data brokers. These kind of companies range from things like credit bureaus like Equifax to people finder websites to market research firms and many, many more. They range from these big multinational corporations to super hyper-localized providers that like focus on like a single town or a specific piece of like data. Some of these corporations even reside completely offshore. So they collect and trade information such as social media presence, website clicks, API hits, email tracking, list brokering, predictive scoring, online and offline data. Most of the workings that they do are unregulated. Like the people like Equifax will get regulated by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and anyone that's handling medical data has to comply with HIPAA. But other forms of list brokering have no regulation whatsoever. And so an interesting and concerning part of this industry is that the tail of companies is extremely long. There are only a couple really big brand name companies, but there are tons of mid to small size companies, and they all trade data with each other. And this is what's known as the affiliate storms, where like there's just you'll have a single provider that has one massive backend, and there'll be hundreds of companies that all plug into that backend and have a front end that just displays the information in a different way. And this becomes increasingly important when a consumer wants to opt out of this kind of processing.
So one part of it is called list brokering, and it's particularly sketchy. So for some brokers, no list is too obnoxious to sell. For example, dementia sufferers list was sold and is bought by scammers who telephone people with dementia and scam them out of tens of thousands of dollars. Everything from home addresses of police officers to like any kind of medical condition. You can buy a list of people, their home addresses, and their phone numbers. So let's say you didn't want to be on one of these lists. How would you go about opting out? So it's basically impossible, which is what we found from our last idea. So basically, when you can find an opt-out form, it's something that looks like it was built in the 90s. It asks for very intense personal information, oftentimes your social security number. And then, again, there's 4,000 of these brokers, and there's no central list. So you may be able to opt out of like 5 or 6, or maybe even 2,000, but they have more, and they all trade with each other. So if you opt out tomorrow, the next day they could buy all of your information again. So this is also where to find the opt-out in the privacy policy of the first website we looked at, Finders. So yeah, it's effectively impossible. And then the funny thing is, there's no legal obligation for them to actually offer opt-outs. So what that also means is that when you're opting out and you're putting this information in, they can sell that data. So they can sell it before they even opt you out. So it's really just like it's an impossible thing at this point without new regulation.
And they can sell it to anybody who comes along with money.
Correct.
Yeah, like we've gone to some of these companies and like, hey, can we get some information? And then they'll be like, what are you using it for? Oh, we're gonna give it to the consumer. They're like, oh, wait, no, we can't sell it to you anymore.
That was the only line, yeah.
That is it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so like what companies use these? Well, like almost every large company is using data brokers in some form, whether it be for customer acquisition, amassing offline data. And it's also really difficult to figure out exactly which companies are using data brokers. Like most of them won't disclose it because it's normally a bad PR look.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, Facebook in 2014 announced that they were buying from data brokers to get a better picture of your offline life. So speaking of Facebook, Facebook hit the headlines this week as part of a quote data scandal associated with Cambridge Analytica. So it was discovered that Cambridge Analytica had access to 50 million Facebook profiles. And so people are asking questions about, okay, how is it possible that Cambridge Analytica could do this? And obviously Cambridge Analytica is the company that helps sort of, they use data science for political preferences. Mike will talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, so this whole scandal was a bit interesting. And so Cambridge Analytica was using Facebook as a vehicle to conduct their market research in order to power their micro-targeted advertising campaigns. And so researchers in 2014 were using personality surveys and were getting people to download apps, which would then scrape their information from their Facebook accounts, including information about their friends. This was activity that Facebook had permitted at the time, but has since banned. And most people were unthinkingly connecting their Facebook account. Of the 50 million profiles they collected, only 270,000 had actually given proper consent. And oftentimes, one person would leak the information of hundreds of their friends when they would do a form like this. And so they acquired all this information, and the goal of the study was to find silly correlations between people's habitual tendencies and their political preferences. They were searching for latent voter trends and behavior triggers that they could use in their advertising campaigns. They differentiated people by 5 traits and used those traits to interpolate and categorize people into 32 different groups, which they used for the campaigns. And a good example of something they found was a strange correlation between anti-Semitism and Kit Kats.
People like Kit Kats.
Yeah. And so once they had a good understanding, of these correlations, they were able to use the Facebook advertising platform to test their algorithms and see how far their influence could reach. And so they're a pretty interesting company. It's a company that combines politics with data science and intense market research. And it's hard to strictly claim that everything they're doing is illegal, but some of the methods they're using are undoubtedly shady, and it's such as ignoring consent and using these deceptive tactics to collect this information. And another interesting thing is the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, the SCL Group, has won contracts with the U.S. State Department and is even trying to work with the Pentagon.
By the way, the co-founders of Cambridge Analytica are Steve Bannon and one of the Renaissance founders.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so the effect of this was pretty crazy. Not only did Facebook drop 7% yesterday and 3% today, but FANG was down $72 billion in market cap in a single day, simply because Facebook led the trend. This just goes to show not having the proper transparency with your privacy policy can really have a terrible effect on your market value.
Yeah. So the European Union's response was very swift. They want Mark Zuckerberg to clarify before the representatives of 500 million Europeans that personal data is not being used to manipulate democracy. There's also talk about the FTC investigating. This is as of an hour ago. But if history tells us anything about the American policy, not much will happen. And on the other hand, Equifax is totally getting a break. They've almost recovered their stock entirely, partially because the U.S. government has passed some new laws that make it harder for consumers to sue Equifax in the wake of this data breach. And Equifax has also claimed that they've lost no clients as a result. As I said, this is kind of a large trend in American policy toward data protection. In fact, last year there was a bill that was passed that allows internet service providers to sell browsing history. And of course the repeal of net neutrality, which means that broadband is no longer a public utility, even though every household in America paid $2,000 toward the $200 billion infrastructure investment in the 90s for fiber optic infrastructure.
Yeah, so when it comes to privacy, are Americans screwed? Is there anyone that will step in and help us?
So possibly the European Union. They actually may be the ones introducing data protection. So the GDPR is kind of the new sheriff in town, aka General Data Protection Regulation. And what it means is that European citizens get much more control over their personal data. And for any business worldwide who fails to comply with the new European citizens' rights, the EU will impose fines of up to 20 million euros or 4% of global revenue, whichever is higher.
And so to give a bit of background, Europe's always had a bit of a different stance than America in terms of data privacy and security. Starting in 1995, the European Data Protective Directive was established, and the idea of this was to regulate the processing of personal data in the EU. The directive established concepts like collecting proper consent before processing, sharing personal data required consent as well, and they also allowed consumers to rectify and hold corporations accountable for their practices. This directive really encapsulated a big sentiment difference in the way Europeans think about their privacy compared to Americans. And the increasing influence of multinational corporations in Europe has spawned them to take this initiative to the next level, and that is what GDPR is.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what the new rights are for Europeans. So they have the right to be informed about all of the data that's being collected in your organization. They have the right to access that data itself, so they can see the raw data in machine-readable format. They have the right to update it if there's any record that's wrong, and they also have the right to be forgotten. So they can say to any company, delete all of the data you have about me. And so that's a huge problem for companies right now to actually get the infrastructure in place to do that. And then there's a whole laundry list of other things. Another of which is called data portability, which means that a European citizen could go and say, hey, Spotify, take all of my music preferences and send it to Apple Music because I'm switching services. And it has to be in a common machine-readable format.
And so some other business applications that come along with this are you, as a business, if you have a data breach, you have 72 hours to announce it, and you have to notify any individuals that were affected by it. You must be able to prove that your company is instilling privacy by design. That means every single office in your company needs to be working together to prove that you're taking privacy seriously and that the information you're collecting is properly secured. You must map out where all the personal data lives in your corporation, and you also have to justify why you are holding that information. And lastly, in many cases, you have to have a data protection officer and a corporate representative that resides in the EU in order to respond to the European legislators.
This only applies if you have European customers, right?
Yeah, you have to have any kind of European data. Otherwise, it doesn't matter for you.
Also, European employers have these rights as well.
Okay. But it still applies even if you have no, like, business entity in Europe, you're not operating in Europe, right?
Yeah, only if you have data of European citizens. So you don't have to have a location there. You just have to have the European citizens because it's their right.
Is there?
Go ahead.
Does this apply with different sizes in some sense? Like the representative who resides in Europe seems like.
Yeah. So that's where, in many cases, like you would need it, but like a very small startup wouldn't.
The last two bullets are depending on the company. So the DPO and the representative are contextual.
Okay, so they're based off the size of the company or something like that? Or what?
I don't know if there's like a strong definition of when it comes in, but loosely correlated with size. Yeah.
Okay.
What's the status of these rules?
They come into effect on May 25th.
So saying that the company I work at, this is like one of their biggest things they're working on right now. Like company-wide, this is a priority for everybody. So like anything, if you were like, I have a GDPR project, you can just like pretty much get any team to jump on board with what you need done.
Yeah, it's huge. So in Europe, the definition for personal data is a little bit different from what it is in the United States as well. It's actually anything that can conceivably be tied to an identity. So of course that's address, name, IP address, but it's also anything that like in the right context can be tied to a single person. So if it's a small town record and it has red Ferrari and there's only one red Ferrari in the small town, that's personal data according to the European definition. So how can companies comply before May 25th? This is our sort of 5-step program. And I should also probably tell you that this does not constitute legal advice, and listening to our presentation should not substitute for obtaining legal advice from a qualified attorney. So with that said, a practical 5-step program is, first of all, map out all of the data in your organization. So look at the data that sits in every database, SaaS tool, data warehouse. Look at your backups, the emails, employee inboxes, and documents within your organization. That's data at rest and data in motion. Everything should be looked at. Then identify which of it is actually personal data, what can be tied to a real person. Can they conceivably be identified from it? And even in a combination of data, could that identify someone? So classify all of that and then also rate it by risk. Always ask, what's the purpose of having this data? Am I allowed to store it? And did I gain consent from the user, or do I have another justification for processing? Then, for each of those, govern the data. So set documentation and rules and roles about who can access the data, and train employees about how that works. And then, of course, protect the data. Encrypt it where possible, anonymize it wherever possible, pseudonymize it. And depending on the context, there's always a sort of balance between risk and value. You have to figure out what it is for each context. And oftentimes, the right answer can just be to hit delete, get rid of the data. If you're collecting it for no reason, you're just storing it. That's not a legal basis for processing under GDPR, and you should just get rid of that. And also just document everything, like everything that you've done to actually come up to compliance, every data impact assessment, just document it all, because when the regulators do come to your door, they're going to want to see that you can produce something to show that you've taken action. So yeah, companies are racing to get this done by May 25th, when the law becomes enforceable.
Yeah, and it's quite difficult. Like a single database is even hard to map out. Like one schema alone might look like this, with all these different connections, dozens of tables, all interconnected. Personal data could honestly be sitting anywhere in any representation. And typically this database is only a small cog in the wheel. You might have some massive infrastructure going on, and this database might feed into 12 different other sources that are all processing data simultaneously. The entire transfer network of information needs to be documented, and the security needs to be locked down. If everyone in your organization has access to all of the data, then you're probably doing something wrong.
So most companies are taking this step by step by step, and everyone's kind of freaking out. But they could also just use software, and there's some companies like Big ID that will help you sort of grok your internal databases and generate maps of person identifiable information. So that's what happens before May 25th.
Which company is that?
Big ID. After May 25th, it's another game. So that's when you actually have to start handling these data requests. So to fulfill a request, there's data that sits in almost every department in your organization. So you have to be able to access or delete data sitting in databases, anything that you log, backups, cold stores, personal data that's sitting in emails, Word documents, HR tools, any kind of SaaS tool, marketing analytics software. So again, this is basically what companies, how they feel. Or again, they can just use software. And this is kind of where Transcend comes into play. This is what we're working on, is a solution for data subject requests. So what we give companies is privacy dashboards that sit at privacy.yourcompany.com. It explains all the everything that you collect data for, why you process it, and it's uses a lot of thread messaging to reassure your clients and regulators that you take data protection seriously. It also has your GDPR data intake request form. So this is where consumers can come and actually make the request, otherwise they have to go through customer service channels. And we have an admin dashboard that's hooked up to all the requests come in, and then we actually distribute a series of automations as soon as that data comes in. So you can connect a bunch of data silos, and it kicks off integration, all of our integrations. So Segment, Office, G Suite, Dropbox, and all of your databases. And it actually compiles the data or erases it. And yeah, that's all we got. So you have any questions, we'd love to chat.
So is it a feature also of what you're working on that if I were an EU citizen and wanted to know what all the data is around me, would you be able to, or do you think that eventually you'd be able to tell me, like, show me a web page where I can see all of the different companies that have data on me, for example?
Yeah, that's eventually going to be the goal. First, we're installing on the companies, and then eventually we'll have the ability to actually give you an account as a consumer, and then just links to all of our dashboards.
Okay.
What's the stance on sort of on data derived from sort of whatever the primary sources are? Like if you have something that's no longer sort of directly personally identifiable, but you have a model, you have like some aggregate statistics, you have something that was derived from personal data. Like what's the threshold to decide like, okay, like if this person requests deletion, I need to change this thing versus I can probably leave that thing alone.
Yeah, so two things. So first of all, if they can't be conceivably identified from it, then you don't need to worry about it. You don't have to delete that. It's not like you have to update their model if it's like an aggregate sum to say like minus 20 or something, if like that was their data point. But you also have to think about, in the first place, did I have consent for the data that went into the aggregate model? So like even before that step, that's something that you'd have to think about.
Is this something where do you kind of know what the standard that they want to use is? Like, is there something where they like intend to apply a differential privacy standard, or is it just kind of like if it seems reasonable but they're not identifiable, that's good enough?
So we're going to see what the jurisprudence, how it gets set. A lot of companies are, everybody has their own interpretation right now. I think at least in the first year we're going to see a lot more of the latter. So just sort of like a reasonable, they're going to sort of eye it up and figure out like, is this appropriate or not? And also something important to know is like a lot of it is going to be context of like why they're auditing you. Like there is going to be some random auditing, but a lot of it is going to be triggered by data breaches. So if there's any kind of data breach or there's a series of consumer complaints saying, hey, they're not fulfilling our data requests, then the auditors will go in. Yeah.
What about the data brokers, because they tend to operate in the background?
Yeah.
Don't want to be seen.
Yeah, a lot of them in Europe are like struggling to become compliant. Because
Two of them have gone bankrupt because of this.
Just trying to accomplish the right.
Yeah, because the investors completely lost confidence with the GDPR introduction. And the rest of them are usually just operating in America. So Equifax won't be able to operate the way they do in America in Europe. But that's almost always been the case because there were some, we talked a little bit about the directive that was there before. And European citizens, depending on the country, a lot of them already had some rights with data protection. And now this is sort of harmonized all of it and spread it across Europe and made it global.
And so, yeah, I guess as far as it being global, there's no way you can just not accept EU citizens' data, right? Or I guess you could put in your TOS that you cannot be an EU citizen and use our product. But otherwise, what do you?
Yeah, it's difficult. so honestly, this is why it's so it's actually so effective right now, and companies who are entirely based in America are coming up to GDPR compliance, is because they basically realize that it's impossible to set these controls in a discriminatory way, and they're just going to do it for everyone. So we're going to have a privacy dashboard. If somebody wants their data, we'll give it to them, as long as we can verify their identity. We're not going to get them to show them your passport, right? And then also there's so many cases where you could have European data. So if you're an American company, you don't even serve European customers. If one of your employees is a dual citizen, technically they still have those rights.
How does this apply to, let's say that you're a search engine and you've spidered the web and there's a web page with an address in it, and it's an address of an EU citizen. Is that, it is identifiable, so I assume, would it be covered then, or is there an exception for certain cases like that?
Not for that case. The only exceptions are if you need to keep the data to perform a contract. So that would be like a bank. You couldn't tell a bank to delete, my debt history or like my criminal record. There are certain exceptions, but basically anything like that, like it's completely in scope. Yeah.
Are we seeing companies, or to your question earlier, try to put things in the terms of service to get around this?
I mean, I don't think there's really a way to. I mean, you mean companies that are just saying we're only serving Americans?
I mean, I'm pretty
just
sure
we're
that
not
13-year-olds click all the time. I'm above 18.
Yeah.
I could go in, like anyone can click to be like, yeah, sure, I'm not an EU citizen. I want to use your thing anyway.
I don't think that would
It's gonna be
preclude.
tested in court.
Yeah, I don't think that would hold up for Europe. I mean, there are some practical limitations. Like if you're entirely based in the United States and you have no form of legal representation, you never plan to, then technically, like they could say like we're going to fine you, but they have no jurisdiction over you. So there are some scenarios where it's like not possible. So I think some smaller companies do kind of say like this is not intended for Europeans. But I think practically speaking, especially in the age of like the internet where everyone's serving people globally, it's just a one sweep solution. And it's actually not that hard to like, honor people's, like if someone asks for their data, it can be done. Like it's not an impossible task. And I think the regulators will be fairly reasonable. They're not going to hit everyone with $20 million, 20 million euro for any sort of small violation.
So what's going to happen to European data brokers? Is it impossible to have a business model that is based on advertising and selling user data?
So advertising itself isn't a problem. It's just the way they get consent to use the data. So I don't know if you go on any sort of like European-based company, you'll see like a cookie consent banner pop up, and you have to explicitly that like everything's opt-in now. You can't like there's no default opt-in that you can opt out from. So people are trying to like implement methods of actually gaining consent, but for like actual European data brokerage isn't a consent-based thing, and it's like third-party data trading.
Yeah.
They're like really screwed.
So now companies have to rely on advertising in their own platforms. They can't.
First-party data is how it's moving. Yeah.
So like
Third-party data,
the way advertising might work is like, so you have someone come to your website and you're like, so first can I collect your information? You get consent for that. And you're like, okay, now can I use your information to put you in like a target group? Then you get consent for that. Then now can I use your target group to send you ads? You get consent for that. Then can I can I use your information and make it available to other parties? Then you need consent for that. So it's like becoming a longer and longer process. You can't just have one checkbox. Like you need multiple. Yeah.
Yes, and as a company like Facebook, how would they operate if that's the barrier to entry for them to be able to do what they do with their data?
Facebook, like when you agree, you have to explicitly. So they just have to be explicit about what data they're collecting. That's basically the baseline. Something like cookie opt-in there's like certain like differentiations, but Facebook is fairly explicit. Like you upload a photo, we're going to store that photo.
And like a good example that already exists is like if you go to Google's terms of service or whatever, and you want to say I don't want to get targeted advertising, they have like a pop-up that will come up and be like, if you opt out of this, then we're not going to be able to give you highly tailored content, blah 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 blah. And for most people, that actually stops them from doing the opt out because they'll be like, you know what, I'm okay with this, and they won't do it.
Yeah, 90% of people who went to the Google opt-out page after reading like the description of how it'll change the service, left the page without opting out.
So yeah, there's a way to do it. It just has to be explicit.
Can you say something like where if you opt out, then you just don't get access to the service?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Facebook could say like you just can't use Facebook if you like opt out of this.
Yeah, there's obviously like sort of a set of things that like will make the service work or not. Mm-hmm. So everyone should just be using their judgment. Like if it's like implicit tracking of like your click stream, that's not as necessary, and that should be like an actual privacy control. But if you say, I don't want you to store my photos anymore, then then they can just say, okay, like here's how you delete your account, and we'll actually wipe all that data. But like you can't use the service without certain consent. Cool. Anyone? Any last questions?
How close do we think the big players are to meeting this deadline?
So I just got an email from LinkedIn today saying they updated their terms of service and they launched a GDPR page. Google and Facebook have launched their privacy dashboards in the past month or two. Everyone else has been waiting to see what Google and Facebook will do, and I think now everyone will be making their own dashboards.
Yeah, this has been a long time. This was passed like middle of last year.
Yeah, and it was put onto the floor in 2016. So it's been a long time coming, but nobody really took it seriously until like everything's heating up right now. Like everyone's going crazy about GDPR right now. Yeah.
How does this affect the U.S. credit bureaus?
So they only they're keeping themselves to U.S. consumers. It may be at least. I think they're totally screwed for their European operations, but like someone like TransUnion, as far as I know.
But any EU visitor comes in, lives here, gets a social security number, and starts filing taxes.
Exactly.
So they're hosed.
Yeah, it's we're gonna see. We're gonna see. Like you're right. You're right. It's a total disaster for them right now. And the idea that like this may be a larger shift in like the way privacy is being and data protection is being thought about. It's like this law may actually come to the United States someday. So they have to sort of rethink the way they work. And you know, their use case as a credit reporting agency may like end up being justified. But there's this sort of superset of data that's not necessary to like just a standard business operation, like those lists we were talking about. And like that's the kind of stuff that these laws will be targeting mostly.
If Equifax were to establish your citizenship and then not track you if you were an EU citizen, that would effectively mean you had no credit standing in the US, which would have serious repercussions as well. They're both bad outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. But also if they are tracking and they don't realize the citizenship of the people, and then those people just start complaining, they're subject to 20 million euros or 4% of global profit or global revenue. So,
what about Visa and Mastercard who oversee? So if you go to a restaurant in Italy and you buy something, that information is now under GDPR, or is it because you're American?
So because you're American, you don't really get the same rights, but that doesn't mean that a European business, they already have all the practices in place. So I honestly, it depends which company, but a lot of them would probably respect an American's request for data. Because if you're based in Europe, you're going to be doing the sort of like full-scale end-to-end solution. And as I said, like a lot of companies are just they're not going to discriminate based on European or not because it's just not practical.
So how are European banks going to be able to figure out who they feel safe issuing a credit card to in Europe?
So there's a lot of there are exceptions to the law. So I actually am not entirely sure how credit reporting works, but I would imagine that they can use one of the legal bases for processing, which is obligation to fulfill a contract. So if they have a contract with the bank and maybe there's like some sort of government contract as well, then
sure,
credit reporting
they need to know whether you've like failed to pay your credit.
Exactly.
The bank, right?
Exactly, and so that would be exempt.
Yeah. You couldn't delete your debt.
In the same way that like your criminal record, like you can't just delete or just like you don't really have control over certain pieces of data value.
Actually, yeah, one other question I guess would be what happens with like, news?
With news?
Because I know under other interpretations of the right to be forgotten, there have been cases where people have tried to get newspapers to delete stories from their archives.
Yeah. That's a good question.
That was held up as not being legitimate.
Yeah, that was my understanding, but I'm wondering if the GDPR has any influence on this.
I don't know. I don't know for that one. Sometimes, so actually, there is kind of like the sort of blackjack legal basis for processing, which is like it's just called like legitimate use, and so this is where a lot of the jurisprudence is going to be set.
Got
And so they've kind of created this like sort of nebulous space where a lot of companies like credit bureaus are trying to sort of like pigeonhole all of their justifications into legitimate use. And that's how marketing will actually be able to fly. But it's treacherous territory because you don't really know what the regulators are going to do. And in that scenario, you just have to use your judgment and evaluate the risk.
But then even in the cases where like the Equifax will get to keep the data they have, they still are under much harsher rules for protecting it and making sure it doesn't get breached and all these other things, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
So there's still some advantage there.
And you can't try to hide a breach occurrence. Like, you can't come out 3 years later.
Yeah, which it usually does.
So just talking
Can't
to
you just pay off the guy who actually?
You can try.
I thought you were about that.
Yeah, didn't work out.
I was talking to one of you, I think it was Ben, about what you got like an electronic citizenship.
Oh yeah,
Estonia.
yeah, Estonia. So this is kind of off topic, but Estonia is. We actually have slides for this. So Estonia is really cool the way they sort of deal with data, and they have this sort of like totally digitized blockchain government thing going on. And they're actually issuing e-residencies to anybody in the world. You don't actually have to be in Estonia, and you can start a business in Europe. And so
They've had things like online voting, and you can pay your taxes all online since like 2001, 2000.
yeah, they had like blockchain in 2008.
And this is a pretty, like, it all runs on this thing called the X Road, which is basically like an individual, through this ID card that they have, all of your personal data is synced to this card. And like, say you're like in an accident, and like you're in an ambulance. The ambulance can take out your card and like put it in and pull up all your medical records immediately. And that pull is documented on like the public blockchain, so that you know that someone is accessing your records and everything's documented. And they have a really cool video.
We were prepared for that question.
Running a modern state is a data-centered endeavor. Ensuring the functioning of the state requires administering very large quantities of data. Estonia lacks a centralized or master database. Data is stored where it is created. Each agency administers its own data separately, and data is not duplicated. At the same time, state authorities and agencies need data outside their purviews in order to function. How can authorities securely exchange important data? First, the data must be easily accessible by the authorities that are authorized to use it. Second, the integrity of the data must be maintained. No third party should be able to make any changes to the data while it is in transit. Third, the data must remain confidential during its journey. It must be protected from the eyes of unauthorized parties. The X Road is a data exchange platform that fulfills all three of these requirements. The X Road helps authorities make work processes more convenient. Many activities can be automated, which frees employees to deal with matters that require human involvement. For the state, the X Road, above all, makes it possible for authorities to efficiently exchange data among themselves. The X Road helps the state see the big picture of how different authorities are connected to one another. The biggest beneficiaries of the X Road are, of course, the citizens. They enjoy the benefits of a better functioning state and save all of the time they would otherwise spend submitting papers and forms. Cool.
Yeah, it's the future of government.
It's legit. Is it open source?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, X-Code is cool.
And the crypto is legit and it's done properly.
Yeah, they've been running for like almost 10 years.
Yeah, they had one pretty big breach in like 2013, I think. Russia, they gave them a run for their money, and they shut down most of their systems. And it affected, like, it was a pretty big influence on like how things work today. But since then, they haven't really had any problems.
Yeah, I think that was even before then. That was before that's what kicked off all this technology. There was a Russian hack that like shut down all of the banks and stuff, and it just like totally destroyed it.
So getting e-residency with Estonia, does that give you no protections?
Yeah, so you can just apply online, and it's like $50 or something, or €50, and like they within a few months they'll have like a consulate in San Francisco, and you go and like they take all your prints and like give you this card. And so if I like need to sign any documents or like start a company or like authorize myself, I have a USB key that I stick my ID card into, and then it like automatically like verifies my identity, and then you can kind of access anything that's like linked to your identity, like all your medical records or whatever.
In Estonia.
In Estonia, yeah, my Estonian medical records. Blank slate. Yeah. All right. Anything else? Cool. All right. Well, thanks, guys. That was really fun.
Thank you.
That's great.